Hello, my lovelies. My apologies for not recording this sooner. I was writing a test for the other class, sorry. So what we are going to look at is percents now. Hopefully this is familiar. First time I did is over of equals percent over 100 was like 6th grade. It was one of the few things that stuck with me because it was useful as long as you could rephrase a percent question so it had the is and the of word in it. So let's talk about this. Equating a percent to an equivalent ratio forms a proportion that we call a percent proportion. Ooh. Use the following guidelines for identifying the amounts of a percent proportion. A percent proportion can be written as the amount over the base times 100% is equal to p%. Or you can move the 100 so you get amount over base equals p over 100. Because then they would no longer be percents, they'd just be the raw numbers, whatever the percent number is, and then 100. Commonly, though, when these are asked, they either have is and of in them, or they can be phrased that way. But we'll say something like 5 is 50% of 10. So 5 is the part, 50% is our percent, and then 10 is the of, or the total that the 5 is in relation to. Now, normally one of those three things you don't actually know and you get to solve the equation, but first we're just going to focus on which part is like where do the numbers go in the formula when you read a sentence. So it could also be percent of base would be percent times base is amount. Could even be written that way as well. Like there is a way to literally translate these into equations, but you're often going to see the is and the of in there. And I find if you can just think of it in that way or rewrite the question into that, that's what I often do in my head is I read the question and then I say they're asking what is 20% of this, or they're telling me that this is 20% of some unknown. So I'm still identifying is and of in there. All right. So for them, amount is what I call the screen went black. Is what I call the is, and then the base is what I call the of. So normally percents are part of one whole, and the base is what one whole is being called here. Sometimes, though, we will talk about percents that are larger than the base. So I don't want you to assume the base is the larger number, but usually it is. And it definitely is if the percent we're looking at is between 0 and 100. It's when the percent starts getting bigger than 100 that the bigger number is no longer going to be the base. So I want you to focus on position more than the size of the numbers. So we'll do is over of equals percent over 100, the raw percent number over just the number 100. So for 1 and 2, we are literally just going to which one's which. So we have 24 cars is 30% of 80. The of often comes before, but the is usually after. So the 24 cars is the amount. The 80 cars is the base value that we're taking the percent of. And then the p-value is, of course, the 30 there. So there's our p. There's our is. There's our of. So if I was going to fill it into is over of equals percent over 100, I would have 24 over 80 equals 30 over 100. So I can see on the right, that's 3/10 or 0.3. And then if you crunch 24 divided by 80, it will also be 0.3. That's what we mean by saying these are a proportion. It means that they The two fractions, as long as you have the parts versus the wholes in the right positions, they're equal. They would reduce to the same raw amount. Then we have 47% of 75 is 3525. So the of is being applied to the 75. So that is our base. Let's change some color at least. And then 47 is our percent, so our P number. And then our is that 3525. So if we were going to write this, it would be 35.25 over 75 is going to equal 47 over 100. And 75, half of 75 is 37.5. And this is a little bit lower than 37.5. So that seems reasonable that that's about 47% of 75. And then using that kind of like base knowledge of my of is my whole, I could figure out what half of that is. That's 50%. I could do half again and get 25%. And you can kind of reason through, is this the actual percentage? Like, does this number make sense? That's what we mean when we tell you, does it make sense a lot of the times. Now, we were already doing this, but we're just going to do it some more. We're going to set up those same proportions. So 17 apples is 25% of 68 apples. So is over of 17 over 68. And note, both of those are apples. So the unit apples would be on the top and the bottom, so it cancels out. We just end up with this proportion of 17 as a part over 68 as a whole. And then we can set that up and say that is 25% over 100%, but the percents are like the apples, they're units, they cancel out. So we end up just with these two fractions must be equal. In later questions, when we get an unknown, we'll have 3 of the 4 numbers and it's solvable. So that's why the practice right now is, can you put the numbers where they go? So now we have 80%. Okay, let's go ahead and 80 over 100. Haha, halfway there. Of 35 is 28. And you note 35 is bigger than the 28 and our percentage is not bigger than 100. And it is in the of position, like that jives. Our big number should be on the bottom. Our smaller one should be on top. But see, here we go. Now we got a percent bigger. We'll put a little star because this is where some people will get themselves confused. So 120%. So there's our P. Still goes over 100, even though it's bigger than 100%. So 120% of 40 minutes is 48. So the 48 is the is number now. And the 40 is the of number. Now note, the 120 over 100, 120 is bigger than 100. So we should see that same relationship. 48 is bigger than 40. So if you're not sure, like, look at what the percent is and then look at the two numbers. And know that sometimes the number on top will be bigger, and that just means your answer is going to be bigger than 100%. All right, I'm going to pause this and then start the next.